Tariffs, taxes, and trade. Oh my. So today we are going to be talking about tariffs. I've had enough people now that have asked me about this. So the way that I do things is, or I guess the way that not all the only way, but one of the ways that I get content for my podcast is, and I may have mentioned this before, but when I get one question about a topic, I'll answer the question, but I won't really give it much thought outside of that. When I get that same question twice, I'll pay attention. And when I get that same question 3 times in a row, that tells me I should probably do a podcast episode about it, because that means that there are also several other people that have probably had that same question, even though they have not expressed it. And so this was not an easy topic either. There's a ton of conflicting information out there about the benefits or the downfalls of tariffs. And after the research, either argument has some merit to it, but neither side is really got it all 100% figured out. There also could be ways of using tariffs correctly or incorrectly that could determine whether or not any of those results end up being positive or negative. So there's just a lot going into this. And ultimately, I'm going to say there is no clear-cut answer that I've got here. Other than, I'll give you information and then you can decide, I guess, which direction you're going to go with that, or what part of this you're going to end up believing. But first off, we need to start at the beginning for all the non-economists out there who are not really familiar with some of the terminology. And so first off, we want to know, what are tariffs, right? And how do they work? What's the purpose of them? And a tariff is essentially, it's a tax on trade, specifically international trade. It is a type of tax that's levied by a country on an imported good at the border. And tariffs have historically been a tool for governments to collect revenue, but they're also a way of governments to try to protect domestic producers. And which means, if they're getting a lot of steel imported from another country, we might put a tariff on steel, causing the imported steel to be more expensive than, say, domestic steel created here in America. And as a protectionist tool, a tariff does increase the price of imports, like I just said. And due to that, consumers would choose to buy relatively less expensive domestic goods instead. And so what that means, well, first, let me go through a little bit more, then I'll go through an example here. The way it works is that the importer has to pay a tax directly. And now that doesn't mean that the importer is ultimately the one that is going to eat the ultimate full cost of that tax, though, because what they could do is just simply increase the price at which they're going to sell that product to the American consumer. In that case, the tax would ultimately fall on the American consumer. So it would not be the importer that actually pays the bulk of that tariff. It could be the American consumer. So that is one of the ways that it could cause a rise in prices. And so in effect, it would be kind of like this. So let's say you've got the choice between an American flat screen TV and a Chinese flat screen TV, and the American flat screen TV might be $500. And then the Chinese flat screen TV might be $300. And so, you know what? If all things are equal other than that, somebody might end up buying the $300 TV. Well, if the government wants to protect American producers of TVs, well, then they would simply just say, hey, we're going to put a tax on the TVs from China. And now China would either have to eat that tax, or they could raise the price of their TV to also $500. And now we're like, well, do I want this American one for $500? Do I want the Chinese one for $500? Or there might be one from Sweden or somewhere else that might still only be $400. So maybe they go buy the $400 one. And so what that does mean, though, is you still paid more money for the TV, even if you didn't get the one from China. And so that is actually how it could increase prices. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give negatives of tariffs, and I'm going to give some positives of tariffs as well. And since this is also a very highly political subject, what I also did was made sure that I got sources from both left-wing sources and right-wing sources. Because like I said a little bit earlier, nobody gets it 100% right. Nobody does. All right. So I want both sides, though, so that that way that I at least tried to stay fair and balanced with this one. So let's go into some negatives to start off with. You know what? Bad news first, right? So, early debates about import protection, they can actually be traced all the way back to the period when Britain imposed tariffs in response to the collapse of the gold standard during the Great Depression, with the idea that British unemployment could have been reduced by imposing certain controls. And some of those studies supported this notion by showing that protectionist countries grew faster in the 19th century by introducing a process of adjustment and distinguishing between short run versus long run effects. And it showed that these tariffs actually increased output and employment in the short run, but that it could lead to a decline in production in the long run. So there's a host of other studies that found either no or limited negative effects from the tariffs. And there's some that show no theoretical presumption about the effect of tariffs on outputs, with the impact depending on the timing and the expected duration of the tariff shock, the behavior of the real wages and exchange rates, the value of elasticities, institutional factors like the exchange rate regime, the degree of capital mobility. And consistent with their theoretical review, the authors found no significant effect of tariff changes on the real exchange rate, the real trade balance, and the real output in their empirical work on 5 different data sets. However, there's a website that I actually really love going to for any tax related information. It's called taxfoundation.org. But it definitely does not have a particularly positive viewpoint on tariffs. And so what I really like for the Tax Foundation is they're really good with statistics. A lot of times that's really all they do is they'll just report statistics without really much spin on those statistics. For example, I've got a whole litany of bullet points here that are actually really negative when it comes to tariffs. It says the Trump administration imposed nearly $80 billion worth of new taxes on Americans by levying tariffs on thousands of products that are valued at approximately $380 billion in both 2018 and 2019, amounting to one of the largest tax increases in decades. So they're equating those tariffs to tax increases. Now, the Biden administration also kept most of the Trump administration tariffs, and in May 2024 actually announced tariff hikes on an additional $18 billion of Chinese goods, including semiconductors and electric vehicles, for an additional tax increase of about $3.6 billion. And this taxfoundation.org also estimates that the Trump-Biden tariffs will reduce long-run GDP by 0.2%, the capital stock by 0.1%, and employment by 142,000 full-time equivalent jobs. Now, I want to read those again. It'll reduce long-run GDP by 0.2, capital stock by 0.1, unemployment 142,000. None of those are huge numbers at all. Definitely not the doom and gloom that we have possibly heard. More bullet points here. Altogether, the trade war policies currently in place that both Trump and Biden put in add up to $79 billion in tariffs based on trade levels at the time of tariff implementation and excluding behavioral or dynamic effects. Before accounting for any of those behavioral effects, that $79 billion in higher tariffs amounted to an average annual tax increase on U.S. households of $625. However, based on actual revenue collections data, trade war tariffs have directly increased tax collections by $200 to $300 annually per household on average. So not the $625 they thought, more the $200 to $300 on average. Now, both estimates understate the cost to U.S. households because they don't factor in lost output, lower incomes, or loss in consumer choice that the tariffs may have caused. Remember back to my TV example, we may not have as many choices because if you only got $300 or $400 to spend on a TV and they cost $500 or $600, well, you got to buy the 3 or 4. So that now when the one used to be within your price range and now it's not, yes, you have limited choices or more limited choices. More bullet points here. So President-elect Trump has promised to impose tariffs of 25% on all imports from Canada and Mexico, and an additional 10% tariff on all imports from China when he takes office. If imposed permanently, the Tax Foundation estimates that those tariffs would generate $1.2 trillion in tax revenue from 2025 through 2034 on a conventional basis. And in the long run, they estimate the tariffs would reduce GDP by 0.4%, so a little bit higher in the long run now, by 0.4%, which still not that much, and employment by 344,000 jobs over that basically 10-year period. And academic and government studies find that the Trump-Biden tariffs have raised prices and reduced output and employment, producing a negative impact on the U.S. economy. That's their final summary of that. So that all sounds horrible. It sounds bad. Sounds like it's we just got through a couple years of inflation, and so now we're talking about putting tariffs on goods and services that we use that could cause prices to go higher. So are we going to have more inflation? Is that the question? I mean, that's a lot of questions that people will have. Like, how does it affect the prices? My wallet. That's basically the question. How does it affect everybody's wallet? And two, how's it going to affect the stock market, which would be people's future wallets, in my opinion, for the retirement. So there's a lot of negatives there surrounding it. Some of the positives, though, there's more nuance than just those facts. The expectation, however, for most imports and exports by most countries, like the expectation is that there is going to be some kind of tariff that is imposed. There is a lot of both what we call tariffs and also something called non-tariff barriers on the international stage today. And one of the things that happened in the Trump administration, there was a lot of talk about increasing in tariffs, but there was not a lot of attention that was really paid to decreases in tariffs that were also accomplished. And this is actually what I think the former president means when he talks about both free and fair trade or fair tariffs, is using tariffs essentially as a weapon or as a negotiating tactic, and to get a level playing field for American producers abroad. And using them as negotiating tools is how we've seen Trump use them. I mean, shoot, I just talked about that little bullet point. A very recent example would be those proposed tariffs on Mexico and Canada. Trump said, and this is his negotiating, right, that this tariff will remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion of our country. Both Mexico and Canada have the absolute right and power to easily solve this long simmering problem. We hereby demand that they use this power, and as such time as they do, it is time for them to pay a very big price. And so he's using tariffs, the threat of tariffs, as a negotiating tool to get other things done. And how do we know that this works? Literally within hours of announcing this, he gets a call from Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And Justin Trudeau said he had a very good call with President-elect Donald Trump. He said, and quote, "We obviously talked about laying out the facts, talking about how the intense and effective connections between our two countries flow back and forth. We talked about some of the challenges that we can work on together. It was a good call," end quote. That's what Trudeau told reporters. And we could even go back to, if we're talking about Trump era tariffs now, we have information on his first administration. And there are some items the first Trump administration targeted. But the question is, did the tariffs work? One of the things that they targeted was Chinese steel. And there actually was a pretty positive impact from that. Although there was a small increase in the price that the American consumers and American businesses had to pay for those steel imports, about 80% of the tariff actually did just get eaten up by Chinese producers. So in other words, the Chinese producers were not able to pass on the full weight of that tariff to consumers in the American market, whether that was individual consumers or businesses. The reason for that is because there were just too many alternative products that were both produced domestically and also produced in other countries like Sweden, where the price was nearly the same. And so if the Chinese exporter were to, again, increase their sales price by the full cost of the tariff, well, then it would have been prohibitively expensive for that particular product. And so everyone would have just bought domestically or bought from producers in other countries like Sweden. And so the result of that was essentially a countering of the subsidies which this Chinese steel industry receives from the Chinese Communist Party. So ironically, you ended up having Chinese taxpayers paying for that subsidy, and then the steel company paying the tariff to the United States Treasury. So in a very roundabout way, Chinese taxpayers were paying the U.S. Treasury. So that one was an example of an extremely successful tariff approach. The Biden administration also left many of those tariffs in place. So they had countless opportunities to reverse many of the economic policies of President Trump, some of which they did. But regarding the tariffs, they haven't. And it's not completely clear yet as to why. I mean, again, this has been at their fingertips, available for them to do at any time, and yet they left most of the tariffs in place. Mainly except for the suspension of certain tariffs or imports from the European Union, the replacement of tariffs with tariff rate quotas on steel and aluminum from the European Union and United Kingdom, excuse me, and also imports of steel from Japan, and the expiration of the tariffs on washing machines after about a 2-year extension. So in May 2024, the Biden administration, I can't even talk today. The Biden administration even announced additional tariffs on 18 billion of Chinese goods for a tax increase of about 3.6 billion. So the reason they kept the Trump tariffs and even announced additional tariffs is possibly because they've actually been very successful, despite what the mainstream media has said. But it's kind of hard to always believe what mainstream media says, because even Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, has said that media has lost the trust of the people. He put out an article, and I'm quoting here now, in the annual public surveys about trust and reputation, journalists and the media have regularly, regularly fallen near the very bottom, often just above Congress. But in this year's Gallup poll, we have managed to fall below Congress. Our profession, talking about the mainstream media, journalists, our profession is now the least trusted of all. Something we are doing is clearly not working, end quote. So there's Jeff Bezos talking about how, yeah, people just don't trust mainstream media anymore. At least the vast majority of them do. So honestly, I feel like if anything, we're better off just assuming the opposite. Well, a lot of times of whatever mainstream media is telling us. But that aside, there's no reason to believe that any of the tariff strategies that Trump would pursue in a second term would cause any of those horrible effects that have been mentioned about what they think could possibly happen with all the tariffs that he wants to put in the second term. Let's see here. Yep. One of the things to remember, again, Trump uses tariffs as a weapon. It's like tactical bombing, not carpet bombing. This is not the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, where we essentially carpet bombed international trade by imposing wildly high tariffs in the name of protecting American industry. Protectionism, when it comes to tariffs, pretty much always ends very, very poorly. But if you're using tariffs to raise government revenue, as we did for pretty much all of our nation's history before the income tax was put into place, if you're using tariffs as a negotiating tool, those are conditions that, again, have proven to be very successful when you look at the historical record. And Trump has been perhaps the most successful when it comes to using them as a negotiating tool. And so there's many things also that, and so like, here's I guess the concern now. So I actually did, give the bullet points of what they think that the tariffs would increase prices or, decrease employment, or however it could affect us as an economy negatively. We had some of those numbers up there. But there's also a bunch of things that Trump has planned to do simultaneously that could even counteract any of those small inflationary effects that the Trump tariffs may have, including becoming more energy independent, which could drive gas prices lower, which would have a domino effect on lowering pretty much the price of anything, any kind of good that we buy in America, because pretty much everything is shipped using some kind of fuel. And so we lower gas prices, we lower the price of pretty much everything. And so ultimately, my summary is that if there is a negative effect, it's going to be a very small negative effect. And that even could be offset by some of the other policy moves that will be happening simultaneously. So I see prices possibly, and this is a possibly, not probably or whatever, possibly going up only in the near term, but going down mid to long term. However, we may not even really feel any of the small increases in those prices, since the other moves that are happening may actually reduce prices. And if the inflationary numbers due to the tariffs are only as small as what was stated earlier, like the 0.2 and the 0.4%, and we had inflation here recently, high as like 9.6%. So yeah, if we're able to bring the price of gas down, the price of all the other goods down that we buy simply by becoming energy independent, we'll have, and deregulation, there's a few other things that could happen, but we'll have a much bigger reduction in prices than from the small increase in the tariffs. So ultimately, do I think this is going to be bad for the stock market? No. Do I think ultimately this is going to have a huge impact on any of our wallets? No, I don't. And for all the reasons that I laid out there. Because like I said, both positives and negatives, to this, and it just happens to come down to really how you use the tariffs. That's really what it is. How they're targeted, how they're used. That's really it. So if you have any questions about how that still might be affecting your retirement or anything else with the new administration, the old administration, any administration, this can, because this administration is going to come and go too. And so the bigger question is, how is your retirement set up for the long term? Do you have a retirement plan set in place, or do you just have a bunch of investments with no plan on what to do with those investments? They're just there, and you're going to take out money when you need it and just hope the stock market goes up. We call it the hope and the prayer plan. So if that's the case, reach out to us if you're still concerned, because we want to make sure that we want to set up plans knowing that there will be downturns in the market in the future. We know this. We know there will be. We just don't know when. Nobody knows exactly when those are going to happen, but we know they're going to happen. So we set up portfolios in such a way that we account for that. And so we want to make sure that you can do well in any administration, in any stock market environment. We want to make sure that you've got stuff in place that's going to mean that your plan is going to work. You're going to have money left over when you pass away. That's our ultimate goal. So that's it, guys. Hopefully that helped. Maybe it helped, maybe not. Maybe it's still clear as mud. I don't know, but that's my take on it. So ultimately, I don't really think tariffs are going to really have that big of a hit on any of our financial things that really matter to us personally, our wallet, how much we're spending whenever we buy anything, and the stock market. So our current income and our future income, I really don't think it's going to have that big of an impact. So there you go. Feel free to agree or disagree with me. If you agree, send all those to asknate@retirementrescueradio.com. And if you disagree, send all those to josh@retirementgroup.com. No, you can send them all to me. I don't care. Yeah, that's it, guys. Take care. I always want to continue to bring you information to empower you to live the retirement you deserve. Take care, and especially this holiday season. If I don't see you before Christmas, have a Merry Christmas.